Hello and welcome to the Manthan podcast. We bring to you this series to talk about the contextual challenges that the Indian Himalayan region faces, and we try to bring solutions that blend community, partnerships, technology, as well as, tradition. And so we're into our second season now. And today's episode is titled Nature Based Solutions for Water Security in Himalayan Cities. And we're going to be exploring how nature based solutions can actually help us rethink the way that we conserve and manage water. And we're honored to have with us today Dr. Rajesh Thadani, who is a renowned forest ecologist, and he's also the editor of the upcoming 2-volume book on Himalayan forests in a changing world. And he's also a leading voice on ecosystem services and issues pertaining to anthropogenic challenges in the Himalayan region. So, good morning to you and welcome, sir. We're delighted to have you.
Good morning, and thank you for having me here.
So we're going to be changing the format of this episode a little bit. We're going to be working and looking at 4 segments. We're going to decode a few important terms related to today's episode here with you today, sir. And we'll make sure that we're all on the same page. And we'll simplify really essential terms that are related to today's topic. So we'll start with the big one, nature-based solutions. So I'm going to ask you, in the context of Himalayan cities, how can this be applied to the ground and what does this actually mean?
So nature-based solutions are pretty much what it sounds like. They are solutions or solutions to issues that are addressed using actions or interventions that utilize natural processes and ecosystems to address a range of societal challenges. They differ from other kinds of solutions in that they tend to be not engineering heavy, which is the way we currently look at, we look at quick fix solutions that have some sort of engineering thing, build a pipeline, build a water impounding structure, whereas nature-based solutions work with the environment, work with ecosystem services, work with issues such as afforestation or using ways to conserve water naturally. They tend to be much more sustainable than engineering solutions. They tend to be more resilient. And they also tend to be more inclusive in that nature-based solutions usually incorporate dialogue with the community, ownership of the community. And I think as we talk, I'll provide more examples of this and we can dig deeper into it.
Absolutely.
Are they also a little more economical? Could one say that?
Yes, they usually are much more economical. The results sometimes are a little slower, but in the long term, they tend to be much more economical. And again, during the course of our discussions, I'll try and provide some examples of how they're more economical.
Right. So, meaning we live in a digital era and we are very familiar with the digital ecosystem in a way, like our devices talking to each other. But when it comes to the on-ground understanding of natural ecosystems, how do you define or what is ecosystem services as per your definition?
So ecosystem services, put very simply, are the benefits that humanity draws from nature. They can be various kinds of goods, things like timber, non-timber forest products, or they can be services, anything from flood control, from natural water. The springs that our mountain cities depend on is an ecosystem service as well. So there any kind of service that is derived from nature. The air we breathe is a result of nature because we breathe out carbon dioxide, but we need oxygen to survive. That oxygen is produced by trees, by green plants, by autotrophic plants. So to understand what ecosystem services are, I'd say, think of yourself being on a spaceship going to Mars, since that seems to be what is thought of now. Everything that is required on that spaceship, we have to find a way of producing, be it oxygen, be it food, be it shelter. But here on planet Earth, a lot of those things are given to us by nature. Oxygen, I talked about, food, clothing. I mean, the cotton clothes we wear, they're produced by natural processes. And also nature helps us, regulates the environment, ensures that there is no buildup of toxic gases, ensures that there is rainfall to nourish our crops and us. So all of those would be examples of ecosystem services.
What's like? I'm guilty of saying that I do not quite understand this, but if you can break this further, what is watershed management in that situation? Like, is it a geographical area? How is it defined?
So I think let's talk firstly about what is a watershed. So any area of land that is connected by water would be called a watershed. So any area over which, if water is dropped, it flows down to a common source, a common stream, or a lake or a reservoir, that will be called a watershed. Now, watersheds can be of any size. In the mountains, when we look at it, we talk about smaller watersheds, which are maybe 1,000 hectares, a few square kilometers, side of a mountain, and all the small little streams or rivulets coming down that form a watershed. But you can also talk about a large watershed, the Gangetic watershed, for example, which would include all of Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, and several other states as well. Now, the concept of watershed is important. It's used as a development unit. So when we talk about watershed management, it's a natural development unit. When we're walking across a landscape, we don't know where the boundary of a village is or where the boundary of a district is. These are artificial boundaries that we have imposed on the landscape. But a watershed is a natural boundary. One side of a ridge and everything flowing on that side of the ridge is the watershed. The ridge, the little mountain, defines where that watershed is. And one side is this watershed, the other side is the other watershed. So it is used, it is important because the quality and quantity of water that comes into that common stream or reservoir is all of that water will be dependent on what the status of the watershed is, both in terms of quantity and in terms of quality. It is also useful because it's a development unit. So we can do a whole bunch of interventions there related to livelihoods, related to production, agriculture, industry, whatever. And it will impact that common pool of water.
What's a development unit?
Any unit that we define over which we do developmental activities. So the government will say, we'll do a block is a development unit or a district or a village. So any arbitrarily defined unit over which we do some developmental activities.
So if there's a naturally created watershed that occurs, and if I through my anthropogenic activities change the topography of the land and create a ridge or create structures like dams, am I splitting the watershed in a way?
So typically you won't split the watershed because even if you create a ridge, the water on both sides of the ridge will just flow into the same watershed. But yes, theoretically, if you can create, like the US sometimes talks about creating great walls. If you can create some great wall, which we could theoretically split the watershed into two. But by creating dams and all, what we typically do is just enlarge that, the water would flow into a stream which would then flow out of the watershed. We trap that water in the watershed by creating a dam, keep it there for a little longer so that we can use it when we need it.
I see. So, and what's a spring shed in the same line?
So a spring shed is a unit that is used more, and I think maybe I should back up a little bit and go deeper into these terms. So when we talk of watersheds, we talk of a ridge to valley approach.
Okay.
So from all the ridges around coming into the valley is a watershed. Now a spring shed in theory could be the same. It is the area over which springs are recharged. So now often you will have a ridge to valley approach. On the ridge there is percolation, penetration of water, and then somewhere down in that valley that spring will emerge, in which case it's the same thing. But a spring shed can be quite different. You can have a mountain and the water recharges on one side of the mountain, flows through that mountain and emerges on the other side. So when we talk of spring sheds, we often talk of valley to valley approach because we are fairly sure that everything between the two valleys, that's going to be the area over which a spring is recharged. It can't be recharged from downstream usually, it'll be upstream somewhere. But where on that mountain, whether it's the same face of the mountain where it is emerging or whether it is some other face, we don't know unless we can look into the hydrogeology of that spring a little bit better. And that is some of the work that we've been doing now, is trying to understand the geology of mountains, trying to understand what are the recharge zones of the springs. because it's not that the springs are recharged from all across the landscape. There will be some zones where the penetration of water, the percolation of water is much higher, and that could be within the watershed or in the adjacent watershed. And hence the concept of spring shed to define where the spring is recharged from. So spring shed, we talk of valley to valley approach, and watershed, we talk about ridge to valley approach.
But having said that, they can overlap.
Oh yes, they can
They
overlap, and often they do.
Right. So you also mentioned something called hydrogeology.
Yes.
I think
because we're trying to break
we're trying
down
to really
words here, so
understand what it is, and I'm going to throw one more at you: aquifers. Okay, so if we can really break those down too.
Right. So hydrogeology is again just made up of two words: hydro or water, and
Right.
geology.
Okay.
So it is the science of trying to understand how water flows through geological structures, which is essential if you want to understand springs. So springs are what? Where, somewhere where two layers of rock or a fracture in the rock meets
Right.
the outside and water is emerging from it. But how did the water get in there? Where did it come from? It's not that God put it there. It got in through some part of the landscape. Now, how did it get there? How did it flow out of there? Is stuff that we would look at in hydrogeology.
Okay.
Now, you asked about mountain aquifers.
Right.
So an aquifer is just an underground zone, below ground area. It can be of rock, of soil, of fractures in the mountain, which can hold a certain amount of water and which can transmit water. So to look at it in just to give a sort of trivial example, if you have the road out there and you put a pile of sand on it, a big pile of sand. Now, if you were to just pour water on the road, it would just flow. But if you pour it on this big pile of sand, it will sink into the sand. So the sand acts as an aquifer. It holds that water, but the water, as you keep pouring on that sand, will also gradually flow out. And when it meets that impermeable layer of the road on which you put the sand, the water will flow out between that sand and the road, and that's sort of a spring forming. So the aquifer is just a area underground which can retain water due to the composition of it. It could be made of gravel, sand, or any kind of soil which can hold a certain amount of water, and it will also transmit water. So the water will gradually move through it into some other area.
But understanding all of these that we discussed are important towards, let's say, coming up with what nature-based solution to be given in a certain area.
Yes, that and of course understanding forests as well would be rather important for that. Yeah.
Right. Oh,
there's one more, right?
There's one really, it's a very provocative one, greenwashing. Okay, so how are we ensuring that nature-based solutions aren't just a facade or, just token gestures? How are we ensuring that they're actually working, and because these are nature services that we can't monetize them, they're just given to us free of charge, but how do we ensure that they're not greenwashed and they're actually beneficial?
So in fact, when you talk about monetizing, this is an area that people are working on and I've also been looking at a lot now, is in our current society, I think unless something has some monetary value, we often don't understand the importance of it. And this is something with ecosystem services that has been done for a long time. I mean, there was a scientist in Calcutta in the 1960s who had calculated the value of trees. And saying, a tree is worth, it was some fairly absurd number at that time, 55 lakhs or something, because of all the oxygen it produces, because of, so you had monetized that if the tree didn't produce oxygen and if I need to produce it in a factory, how much is it going to cost? So you can monetize it, and there are a whole lot of economic ways. This was a rather simplistic way, but there are a whole lot of rather more complex economic analysis to monetize ecosystem services. But greenwashing, which is what you asked about, I think that's an important term to talk about, because it's a term that is often used now. And it is what it sounds like again. It's green, which gives connotations of nice, nature-based, and whitewashing, which you just do a cover-up, a chipa chapi, a potapati, whatever you want to call it. And it's something which is being used increasingly. So when you talk about nature-based solutions in mountains, and you see all these mountain developments coming, it starts with having a very nice green name, Green Valley or Forest View or Oak Ridge or something, and it has nothing. It's all barren, but that name in itself is misleading. So that would be an attempt at greenwashing. Or they will say we are doing, it's in harmony with nature, and we produce some of our own electricity or our own water or whatever. And there'll be one little roof runoff tank or 2 solar panels. So it is an attempt, often a marketing attempt, to mislead consumers by creating either images. Again, the advertising material will have all these green leafy trees, whereas the actual development may not. For example, when you're talking about a development construction, but also in other ways as well. Afforestation efforts. We take a pristine forest, and this is something that comes up when we talk even on things like CAMPA and compensatory afforestation. We take a pristine forest which is rich in ecosystem services, and we need to divert it for some reason or the other. Sometimes for developmental reasons, you need to cut that pristine forest. So you say, okay, I will plant an equal amount of forest somewhere else. But is that forest of similar quality? Is it able to provide those kinds of ecosystem services? There's a big difference between a primary old growth forest and a plantation of poplar or eucalyptus that has been grown. It might be occupying the same amount of area, but it's not providing the same services in terms of biodiversity, in terms of a whole host of other ecosystem services that you'd be looking at.
But how do you then is there a line that one can draw that this is sustainable and this is greenwashing? Like, I understand the magnitude of the impact being 2 solar panels, and this would not constitute as sustainable.
So it's not a black and white thing.
Right.
It's a whole gradation and shades of grey. And I think that is something in today's society we need to learn to recognize better. It's not that something is either perfect or hopeless. It can be somewhere in between, and usually is somewhere in between. And in that spectrum from black to white, somewhere we have to put this arbitrary definition of this is not real, it is greenwashing, and okay, this is at least a genuine attempt to do something well. And it is subjective, it is qualitative, it is difficult to say. And complexity is just something that I think we need to learn to deal with, and something we need to address. And greenwashing comes in that category, I would say.
Great. I think so that brings us to the end of our first segment. And the idea was that these terms are going to be used throughout the episode. So we just wanted to touch upon those briefly right now. And we're going to dive deeper into these in the next segment. So we now move into our second segment, which is essentially Manthan. So since this is the Bharat Manthan podcast, we're going to be doing a lot of deliberation and Manthan on today's topic, which is around water security challenges and nature-based solutions in the Himalayan region. Just what is the situation in terms of the kind of water challenges or water security challenges that are there in the Himalayan region today? Do you think, is there a water scarcity or a water security issue?
So certainly, there is a water scarcity issue, I think, across the country. India is one of the countries where water stress is regarded as being very severe. So globally, if you look at it, India is in a difficult situation. If we look at the mountains and mountain cities, the problem is much worse. Do you want me to talk about
Absolutely,
the reasons
yes.
right now? So this is because of several reasons. One is just the external reasons, the climate. Most Himalayan cities are situated in a monsoonal belt, which means that the rain comes for 4 months of the year. 70 to 80% of the rainfall falls in those 4 months of the year. And that's a period when you have excess water. There's a plentiful abundance of water, in fact, too much water, which in a mountain area leads to landslides and all sorts of disasters. And then the remaining 8 months, we have a paucity of water. Now, this is true everywhere across India, that you have excess water and then a paucity of water. But in the plains, it's easier to store water, to build reservoirs, lakes. It's just much easier. In the mountains, that is not the case. In the plains, you have aquifers, which tend to be bigger, larger. There is more storage of water. So you see a city like Delhi, we've been extracting groundwater for hundreds of years, and we are still able to. The water table keeps falling, but we can. Mountain aquifers tend to be much smaller, much shallower. They have much more limited water. And we are more dependent on a more limited water source. The other problem with mountain cities is that as they expand, uh, eventually the local supply of water is going to be limited. We need to draw water from beyond, from far away. In mountains, it's much more difficult because the infrastructure to bring in water is more expensive, is more vulnerable, more prone to disasters. You see towns in the Himalayas, now you look at Simla, they are trying to lift water from 5,000 feet below. So just the cost of pumping up water that kind of to those kinds of heads and of maintaining that infrastructure becomes much more difficult. So mountain cities just tend to be more vulnerable also to disasters. The Himalaya is one of the youngest mountain ranges globally. It is much more. It is not fully cemented. It's much more fragile. It's much more prone to landslides, and the monsoons make that much worse. So mountain cities are more vulnerable to any kind of infrastructure also being made, and that exacerbates the problem.
But I think in this, I'd like to ask you, given that, we know that water emanates from these mountain peaks, the Himalayas, for instance, and we know that the communities also realize that there is a certain paucity of water, like you mentioned. So are there ways that, if you could talk about what nature-based ways have the people, or indigenous ways of how they've been storing water in these regions?
So there have been, of course, traditional systems of water storage. The Nolas, the Dhars, the Ghouls, there have been traditional systems. But these usually tap spring water. They store or subsurface seepages in many cases, in the case of Nolas. And the subsurface seepages or springs are tapped. They are collected in a certain area. So there might be some sort of a stone structure to collect them, or a tank of some sort, and then they distribute the water through this. What is equally important and not talked about so much, I think, is the culture that goes behind it, the cultural and spiritual sort of significance of these traditional structures, because they encouraged people to respect the water supply. They encourage people to respect the catchment of that spring. And usually you will find that there would also be some sort of structure, some mandir, something to protect that spring, the catchment of it. So while these were only structures to collect and distribute water, they were also culturally and spiritually important and helped in the protection of those catchments, in keeping them afforested, in ensuring that the water percolated into the aquifer and collected into the aquifer.
You think they're no longer as relevant as they were?
Yes, clearly they're definitely not as relevant as they were. And as the government, which has been very well-meaning and has set up, there have been programs like Jal Jeevan Mission, Swajal, but these have been largely programs aimed at water distribution, not at looking at the source of water. And I think that has been the paucity of planning and thought that has that exists today, that we can distribute water. So now people in many villages have got pipelines and standposts coming into their house. So they expect this running water, and there's this very nice, well-built pipeline that is coming there. But the pipeline has to still be fed by a spring or a stream, and we haven't looked into those, and we aren't protecting those structures. So when we look into, again, let's say, issues of urban water supply, we look at a town like Almora, let us say, which was which was known for its springs. There were between 100 and some people say there were 365 springs there.
In Almora itself?
In Almora itself, there were at least 100 springs. That's well documented, and perennial good springs.
And how many of those remain today?
Now it's 20 or 30 or something. But the city was dependent. It was known for these springs. Now, as the city grew, obviously, these springs cannot sustain. So, I'm not saying that we should only be dependent on the springs. If a city grows from 10,000 to 100,000, it will exceed the capacity of local springs to supply water. We need to then draw water from further away. But what happened in Himalayan towns, and Almora is a great example, is that we totally neglected the local springs. As a result of which, we totally neglected the catchment of these springs, as a result of which they've all started drying up. We blame climate change. We blame, I mean, climate change does have a role to play, but it's not as much of a villain as it's made out to be. So we neglect these local sources and we draw water from further away through pipelines and all. And we forget, again, that whole cultural, spiritual bit I talked about, we forget where that water came from. We also, vulnerability goes up. So if 100% of your water is going to come from 100 kilometers away, if that pipeline is disrupted for any reason, you have no water suddenly. Overnight you go from having water to no water. If those springs, those local sources had been protected, it has great implications to vulnerability. That if something happens, there is a storm, there is a disaster, at least your local sources are still going to be active, at least some water will still be coming. But that is one of these big issues I have with, looking at things in this very engineering-heavy, mechanistic way, that we forget what is already there. We forget to protect what already was ours.
I think this is beautiful because this echoes exactly what we discussed with a podcast guest for season 1, where we spoke about the indigenous practices of Nolas. And these were community members who are actively working towards preserving these Nolas.
Right.
And we learned a lot about these. But the irony of the situation is, how I perceive it is, the Indian Himalayan range, or the region of it, constitutes of so many rivers and everything water related. A lot of our own major rivers originate from there. However, we do see a lot of challenges with regard to water security. So recently we were in Nainital and we finally managed to spot a Nola. And after looking for it for a while, we finally spotted one. But then we was watching the water stream coming down, and as pure as the water was, there was a small dump of solid waste. So packets of chips and other bottles there, which is not helping the water stream reach the Nola, firstly. And second is that it was making it impure in the sense that it would not be fit for consumption.
Right.
So that challenge also exists, that, well, what you were mentioning about distribution, while preservation of these indigenous practices should be in place, but we also need to ensure that the tourists or the people who are coming in.
Yes, I think this issue of quality is a very important one, because some of the work we've done recently, more than 80 to 85% of the springs in the Himalayas are contaminated, have choleriform bacteria, have E. coli, and it's a result of not preserving the hygiene around it. Some of the projects, the programs also that we've been encouraged to do, for example, we try and be open defecation free, which is extremely important. But to do that, we make these twin pit latrines from where the water just soaks into the ground below. Now, again, there's nothing wrong inherently with this design, but care needs to be taken to ensure that these are not made just above a water source or above a subsurface water flow. Because if it is, then the contaminants, the fecal choleriform, get into the water and pollute the water.
Right.
If we aren't careful with urban pollution, for example, or even agricultural fertilizer use, the nitrates get into the water, making it unfit for consumption. And this is a problem we are finding with water supply, with springs, which we used to think of as being pristine. They are contaminated with choleriform bacteria, they're contaminated with nitrates. So, exactly, it's not just the plastic packets and the landfill sort of debris that is thrown into springs. It is also this contamination,
Chemical component.
which is not visible, where the water still looks clean but is not fit for drinking any longer.
Right. And just coming back to the NbS aspect, I'm an engineer, and Tanya here, she's an urban planner. We want to understand what drew you towards NbS in terms of addressing water security. Like, what is so different that in the technological aspect or the engineered solutions that probably brought you towards taking NbS into consideration?
Well, I'll say it's the only solution to me.
Only solution?
It is the only solution to water security.
Okay.
Because again, I differentiate between holding the water and distributing the water.
Mm.
There are excellent engineering solutions which may be better than NbS type solutions to distribute the water, and pipelines being the example. But a pipeline is of no use unless you can fill that pipeline with water. My question is, how do you fill that pipeline with water? Now, that means you need to have water to fill that pipeline. In the Himalayas, we talked about, there is a long dry season which hits every single Himalayan city. Even cities in the northeast, which are some of the wettest areas. I mean, Cherrapunji, we learnt in our school textbooks, in those days was the wettest place on earth. But even Cherrapunji suffers from water shortages because there is a distinct dry season when there isn't enough water. So the only way is to hold the water during the dry season. Now, there are multiple ways of doing that. And as an engineer, you might say, hey, no problem. I will just build a large dam or a reservoir or a tank. And yes, that is a solution that works. If you can build a large enough dam or reservoir and use the water from that, then it's fine. You don't need any other nature-based solutions. But how much is that being done? How many examples of that can you give me? Maybe Tehri Dam, yes, it's a large enough dam that it can hold water. You don't need anything else. But pretty much every other city or most cities in the Himalaya are dependent on springs or rivers that are fed by springs. So, and all of these are dependent, therefore, on mountain aquifers. Or yes, in the west you will find, and maybe we can talk a little bit about that, but in the western Himalaya you will also find rivers and rivulets that are dependent on snow melt. So that's another way of storing water. So either you have dams and reservoirs, or you have glaciers, and we can talk about that, or the cheapest way is mountain aquifers. So I mean, just to give you a ballpark figure, if you take I was just thinking of this a few days ago, a small spring which gives, let's say, 20 liters per minute, which is not a large amount of water. But you multiply that 20 liters by 60 an hour into 24 an hour into 365 a day, and you get close to 10 million liters of water. Now, that's a fairly large reservoir you're going to need for replacing that one little spring. And that's why nature-based solutions are important, because they are incredibly cheap. In a seismically active zone like the Himalaya, you don't want to be building too many reservoirs. There's an earthquake and you can have a disaster, for example. Siltation rates are very high. You build a reservoir, it's extremely expensive, but within 10, 20 years, it might get silted over if it's not a large enough reservoir. So the solution has to be nature-based solutions if you're looking at it in the long term. Engineering solutions can be a quick fix only in some areas and only for a certain amount of time, and they are costly.
Would you say NBS is more intuitive than engineered solution when it comes to building them?
It's the way, yes, it is more intuitive, and it is the way that it has always been, right? We have, mountain people have been dependent on springs, and to maintain those springs, you need forests, and we can talk about that maybe a little bit, and natural recharge areas. So shallow ponds, which used to be great recharge structures in many places, and all of these were seeped in tradition and culture again. People used to recognize this, and maybe later on we can talk about some examples where people recognized the importance of these natural recharge structures, but they've still been neglected.
Right. So people's association with water and nature, we know, has been very crucial to these Himalayan communities in north and northeast regions both. So how would you say forest health, does it actually influence how much water is available in these regions? Is there a connection between the two?
Yes, there is. And unfortunately, people have often created a lot of confusion around the role of forest. And the role of forest is still not perfectly understood. But let me just put it in very simple terms. Let's compare a forested area with an area that's cemented landscape or something. Now, what's the difference between the two? It's only that the forested area holds water for a certain amount of time. The cemented landscape lets all the water flow down. Now, how does the forested area, what does it do? First, when rainfall or precipitation falls through the forest, it hits the leaves or the trunk or whatever. So it slows down. So the impact of that rainfall is slowed down, so it is much less erosive. It doesn't just hit the soil, make the soil fly in all directions and erode the soil. it flows down much more gently. Often, a lot of the water in a forest actually comes as stem flow. So the leaves directed to the smaller branches, to the larger branches, and then it comes down the stem. So that erosive effect, impact of water, which is very deleterious and causes soil erosion, is lost. Then the water reaches the forest floor. And now is when it starts becoming very important. If you look at most of our well-known Himalayan trees, if you name a tree, it'll probably be something like banjo, kuchir pine.
Yes.
These are trees that lose their leaves in the spring. So when the monsoon comes, there is a thick layer of leaves, and like a banjo or a cheer pine, 100% of its leaves fall down in March, April, May. So they're all lying on the forest floor. When the monsoon comes, there is this layer of leaves which acts to absorb that water. Below it is the layer of leaves from previous layers, the duff as it's called, or the litter, the deeper litter layers, which is again the spongy mass. Dig into a pristine forest, you'll see leaves on top, and dig a little deeper, you'll see the spongy black mass, which looks like a sponge, and that holds a lot of the water. So you've got this water being held by these layers, and this is we, in the Himalaya. One of the so-called activities which doesn't have any impacts is leaf litter removal. Local people remove this leaf litter because it's used in animal bedding and to make a fertilizer, which is the primary nutrient input into terrace agriculture. And people say, jungle ko kuch nahi hota. It doesn't harm the forest in any way, but it does for the reasons that I'm telling you now. And because large amounts of this leaf litter get taken out. In some forests, we've seen 40 to 60% of the leaf litter is being taken out. So this leaf litter traps the water. Now, it's not holding water for very long. It might only hold it for 15 minutes or an hour, whatever it is. But in holding it, it allows that water to seep into the ground. So when we talk of climate change, one of the things that we're noticing is short, sharp rainfall showers. Rain comes more suddenly for a shorter period of time and then it stops. Now that cemented landscape we talked about, it's all going to quickly flow down. Now in the spongy layer, it is going to stay there and it will gradually seep into the ground. Then these trees have long roots, which might extend several meters down. They provide channels by which the water can again enter that aquifer. Right? So you've got this saturated layer of leaves above and the water is gradually soaking down, and then you've got these roots going deep down and the water is using those channels to go deep down. So they help the aquifers get recharged and they have a very, very strong beneficial effect. They increase infiltration, they lower the runoff, and of course the species of trees matter, but we won't get into that. Some species, some trees like oaks just do it much better than others like the pines. But this is where trees and forests are extremely important in helping replenish aquifers, because they're not somehow producing water; they're just holding the water there for longer and allowing it to infiltrate into the ground.
So is it like? So can I just cultivate or maintain a forest randomly anywhere across, or is it also strategic place or based on the groundwater table? Like we see the Greenbelt initiative as a way to offset that a lot of cities are doing now. But can it be done anywhere, or is it like a strategic location?
So of course, there is this question of hydrogeology, which in the plains is less important perhaps than in the mountains. In the mountains, of course, it matters because there will be, if your forest is above a completely impermeable zone, the aquifer is not going to be very large, and whether you have a good forest or bad forest, it won't matter very much. Understanding that geology is something in the last 20 years, we've had a lot of advances in knowledge. There's a Pune-based NGO called Aquadam, which has really helped increase our understanding of, across the Himalaya they've worked, and helped increase our understanding of subsurface geology and mountain aquifers. But in general, we may not know where the aquifer is, where it isn't. If you've got enough green areas, chances are you are going to have aquifers somewhere there. So while it is a little imprecise, it does certainly help to have green areas. They may not all be at optimal places. It is, of course, better. I often liken this new understanding we have of spring sheds. It's a bit like conventional bombing and smart bombs, since the world is now at war and these are terms that are better understood. A smart bomb is much more targeted, but it's also an expensive weapon.
Yeah.
So you see, in wars, you're still using conventional bombs because you throw enough of those bombs everywhere, you're going to kill people. And that's all obviously a very negative connotation. But in terms of the positive connotation, in terms of trees and forests, if you plant enough trees in enough areas, you are going to get over enough aquifers that the subsurface flows and the recharge of aquifers is going to improve dramatically. So it's to answer your question, it's better to know where the aquifer is, but if you don't, it's still good to plant trees.
Plant trees, right? It sounds more like a oxymoron with respect to the Himalayan cities being water vulnerable now, but I suppose in forest plantation also kind of brings nature closer to humans, and sometimes that there is a resistance there. We do chase, nature, like natural views for our holidays, but when it comes to our daily lives, we would not prefer the interactions. When I say we, it's the third person we, but generally that we would not want, wildlife or flora and fauna encroaching into human habitats as well, and that it's like the golden argument, and it's like, what is natural? Are humans not natural also? So where do you draw that line? But the Greenbelt Initiative or the fact of planting particular trees anywhere can also provide benefits. If it is more strategic, then that makes it more favorable in terms of improving water security.
Yep.
Divide between what humans, or like where humans live and our day-to-day environment, and where the forest stops, as opposed to encroaching further and further into human habitation, where we also see like a lot of leopard attacks or like predators coming into our spaces of living, that creates a sense of worry or discomfort in a way. What is your take on that?
No, I think that's
How do you balance it? Yeah.
absolutely right. And I'm going to actually talk a little bit about this. So, if you look at the old days, the mountain people were always terrified of tigers attacking, leopards attacking. You look at hunters of those days like Jim Corbett, they were considered heroes because they would get rid of these man eaters. And so, if wildlife gets too close to your house, it's always a problem, it's always a fear. But at the same time, our traditions have been such that we have always respected this wildlife. We have always worshipped also a lot of this wildlife. And if you ask me as an ecologist, I think these apex predators, they can sometimes be inconvenient. But I mean, even when we go out and it's raining now and that's inconvenient, you don't want to get wet.
Yeah.
But it's also life-giving. And if I may, I'm going to actually give you an example from far, far away, halfway across the world, because it's a great example. It's one of my favorite examples. It's a biological term called trophic cascades, which we can talk about, but it's one of my favorite examples from all ecology. And this is from Yellowstone Park in the United States. And the wolves were exterminated from there. Again, these wolves, they attack cattle, they're bad for farmers, you get rid of them, you exterminated them. And then about 20, 30 years ago, they decided we will reintroduce it. This is a national park. Let's see what happens. And they got some wolves from Canada, and people were worried, oh, they're going to eat up the elk and the deer, and what will happen? And the results were such that no scientists had even been able to predict this. Yes, the elk got worried when the wolves came, and the elk started, that's the deer, they started staying away from some areas. But what the deer had been doing was exterminating a lot of the vegetation that grew in nice areas like along the river. And because that vegetation was gone, the riverbed would erode more easily. That would lead to very turbid waters. That meant that the salmon and the other fish that lived in that river couldn't live any longer. And the river had become sort of dirty with a low fish population. Now, when the wolves came, the elks all retreated to the highlands where they were felt more safe, more protected, and not in these open terrains where the wolves could attack them more easily. and the vegetation started coming up. The trees started coming up in those areas. And when the trees started coming up, the erosion became less. And when the erosion became less, the water became more clear. The water became more clear, more fish started coming. When more fish started coming, animals such as otters started coming, building their dams there, creating wetlands. The recharge improved. The diversity of the area increased. The overall wildlife, other than the deer, which were kept in check, and they were in no harm of being exterminated from that area, their numbers were kept down. But every other kind of diversity increased. The river water became much cleaner, so that human beings living downstream were getting cleaner, purer, better water. The wetlands became much better, and as a result of which, that stormwater peaks reduced, and during the dry season there was more water. Your fishing became much better for sport. People wanted to fish, and the number of fish in the river went up. So that entire ecosystem improved because you had put back in that apex predator, and that's what they call a trophic cascade. That you put in that apex predator, and it cascades down all levels.
Yeah.
So sometimes we cannot understand what the importance of a lion or a tiger or a wolf or a leopard is, but they are fundamentally important for these ecosystems. And while when we are living close to it, we might resent it, in the long term, they might help. And when you look at today, agricultural abandonment, one of the big reasons it's happening is because the population of wild boars has gone up, the population of sambar has gone up, and all sorts of deer have gone up, and they're attacking the crops, and that's one of the important reasons for agricultural abandonment in the Himalayas. Maybe if the leopards and lions had been much more common, this wouldn't have been the case. So we can't have simplistic answers to these kinds of questions, and they can be quite interesting.
Well, thank you for that beautifully summarized. I think terminology. I think you described it in such a way that it stays with us. But with that, we come closer to the end of this segment. We had a good understanding into what the contributions of a forest bed can do towards water security. We also learned a little bit about the economic comparisons of NbS and engineered solutions. And we had a small snippet of what man versus wild might look like. And we know, like, a pack of wolves can do much more than just be present there. They might have benefits to the ecosystem, like Dr. Thadani described. It might, bring us a trophy cabinet or something which has spreads or a cascading effect down through different floras and faunas in an ecosystem as well. I think that brings us to the end of the second segment. We would then move on to the next segment after this. So with that, we move on to our third segment, which is we've had the deliberations. We would like to then now understand what are some stories from the fields or the forests that you would like to share with us. So this is something that is it's like it's always had created a conflicting idea in my head that urbanization, we're ever so urbanizing now, that our cities are expanding and we're moving further and further into natural territories. But we need to strike this fine balance that's so difficult to maintain between ensuring that the human population and the animals as well, they strike a strong balance along with what the forests have to offer without actually tipping that. So are there any guiding, so we spoke about NbS, are there any particular guiding principles as to incorporating an NbS or like a nature-based solution as an intervention to ensure that we are successful in maintaining this balance?
Yeah, so as development occurs, cities become larger, our needs increase. We will, of course, have to turn to people like you into engineering solutions. It's not possible to have a nature-based solution for every single thing. But nature-based solutions are incredibly important because they can often be part of the answer. Maybe not the full answer, but usually a cost-effective part of the answer. Often they can completely replace engineering solutions. And they are, they really need to be looked at in a sort of holistic way. I would say among guiding principles, one is you need to have the ability to implement that solution. So you need to protect nature.
Yeah.
I think of nature often as, it's called natural capital for a reason. It's like, you put 100 rupees you have 100 rupees with you and you want to live off that interest. If your needs are very large, you're not going to be able to live off that interest. So that's when you'll have to have some supplemental engineering solutions in a sense. But you need to invest it wisely. You keep it without putting it into an FD or a mutual fund, you're not going to get any money out of it. And you need to ensure that the capital doesn't erode. So, much like money, nature is like that. If the capital erodes, you've destroyed your forests, you've destroyed your recharge zones. Getting back to a nature-based solution becomes very difficult, or getting back to some of those low-cost solutions becomes very difficult. So you first need to protect it. We also need to understand that nature-based solutions, in India, we often say ki, arey, this wildlife parks and forests and all these are the playground of the rich. It's poor people look at their needs. They want agricultural land. They want, development. They don't want all of this. But it's the poor who are most impacted by disasters, by vulnerability, and nature-based solutions actually are most important for the poor. They help protect the poor more. And I'd love to talk at length about it, but we probably don't have the time. To me, one of the guiding principles when we're looking at nature-based solutions is ensuring that the community is involved. Community ownership is essential, and community participation in any kind of nature-based solution. It cannot be imposed from the outside, and that's something that I think we need to learn. And this has been shown in many, many places. Maybe I'll just give you an example. Again, I'm sorry, I'm straying a little bit. But in New York City, again, when we look at, and I'm giving examples from there because often we kind of idolize the West and say, they've worked out the environmental problems. Though, of course, when we look at greenhouse gases, they are the worst offenders. But in some things, in terms of forests, clean rivers, they've done fairly well. And New York City, which you think of as this hub of just urban sprawl and with very little forest, they actually were getting all of their water without filtering it. It used to come from 2 or 3 big watersheds. One of them was called the Catskills. And in the 1990s, they figured that this is not going to be enough. There were 2 problems. One is there's not enough water that's coming from there. And 2, as farming and all expands in that area, people are now keeping more cattle, they're using more fertilizer, so pollution is happening. So the solution was what all good engineers will come up with: let's build a filtration plant.
Yeah.
So the filtration plant was going to cost between $6 and $8 billion, and then the cost of running that plant was also going to be hundreds of millions of dollars a year. But then they said, is there any other option? And they looked towards nature-based solutions, or in those days it was not called that, or ecosystem services, or whatever you want to call it now. And they said, hey, if we work with the people who live in the Catskills, can we figure out a way of keeping our water supply clean and sufficient? And they did that. And there was a long series of dialogues, meetings with the farmers there. The farmers said, why should we provide you with clean water? What is in it for us? And they worked and they negotiated and they came up with a solution. The end result was they spent, instead of that $6-8 billion, only $1.5 billion. There was zero maintenance needs because this is a nature-based solution. And they continued to get more water than they were getting from the Catskills and cleaner water. Yeah. And so New York City didn't have to invest in that $8 billion filtration plant. And if you had invested in that, it wouldn't have helped the Catskills at all. That would have continued to get more polluted. The farmers who already, in the West, you often find farmers very much at the edge because they aren't able to earn enough money, and then they move away from farming. And the East Coast of the United States, there isn't much farming. But here, by investing in those farmers, by investing in processes that were, for example, cleaning of animal waste, it used to be a process that took their time, it was difficult, and then that toxic waste used to get into the waterways. They figured out a way of cleaning the waste in a way that was better, got rid of the waste, it didn't get into the waterways, and it saved the farmers time. So the farmers were happy. The local inhabitants of that region were happy. It contributed because the $1.5 billion went into contributing into their economy. And New York City saved a whole lot of money. So there's a great example of where nature-based solutions was for a large city. We're not talking about some small
Yeah.
10,000 person city. This is a city of 8-9 million people. Was able to use a nature-based solution to avoid a large engineering work that they would have otherwise had to do.
What
And this
was
is
the
the kind.
solution?
The solution was investment in the Catskills to ensure that pollution didn't get into the water supply and to ensure that the forests and natural areas were protected well enough that the water supply remained high even during the dry season. So the investment was in the natural capital of the region, and the investment was in the farmers to ensure that they don't or local inhabitants to ensure that they don't pollute. So give them ways to not pollute. For example, I mean, in Delhi also we have tried once biogas plants. So instead of having a problem of solid waste,
Yeah.
if you have a biogas plant, that solid waste can be converted into good quality fertilizer and into cooking fuel, which is being done in many parts of the country in a small scale. So those are solutions that, you know, they take a little bit of expertise and work to implement, but the end result is far better than any kind of alternate solution that you can come up with.
We know that there's a lot of diversity in terms of the kind of communities that are there in India, especially in these regions. So, do you think, in comparison to the West, has community engagement in India, in this Indian Himalayan region, has it been successful?
I think naturally the sort of if you go into traditional Himalayan inhabitations, the feeling of community was extremely strong, and our communities were stronger, more vibrant, um, and more positive and able to do and achieve much more than anywhere else in the world. Um, India has also been the place where developmental NGOs, the so-called initial Gandhian NGOs, have really shown the way to do good development, and India has been a leader in developmental intervention. So I would say that the community has always had a very strong role to play. In the Himalaya, we look at environmental movements such as Chipko. They were completely community driven, and
Right.
they were the leading environmental movements, which are success stories the world over. Um, and if I look at some of the work that have been done by many of the NGOs across the Himalaya, working with communities, there are a large number of success stories I can talk about. I mean, including some that I had the good fortune to be involved in. So, if you want, we can.
We have the time, yes, please.
So, some of my favorite stories about just community engagement, women and youth. You said so. I'll give an example of both. Um, I used to work for 20 years ago in an organization called Chirag, which I used to head. And one of the programs we started was this Yuvati Shikshan Kendra. It was an adolescent girls empowerment program. And, we advertised it as something of skill building, and we'll teach people tailoring and other such things. So, people would send their daughters there. But what we were really after was empowering those women, teaching them about health, teaching them about agriculture, teaching them about menstrual hygiene, about things that actually made a difference in their life. And most importantly, one which wasn't planned as much, but which was one of the byproducts, was increasing their confidence. And it was a program I really loved because for years later, we would hear of these women who had been through this program, doing all sorts of wonderful things. And one metric of success I remember, which astounded us early on. This was another unrelated project on a World Bank project on diversified agriculture, and one of their norms was, you have to have a balance of men and women. And early on, just before this Yuvati Shikshan Kendra had started, we had done a round of interviews, and we had struggled to find women who fitted the bill. I mean, the men were just much more aware with it. Their knowledge levels were better, and we really had to make an effort to try and get that 50% women, and otherwise we were just not getting it. It was like, nahi, theek hai, thoda unko handicap do, to we can get that number. But 2 years later, we had to do another round of recruitment, and this program had been operational by then for 2-3. When we did the interview, we found the opposite problem. There were suddenly too many women who were qualifying. In fact, the men who had been left behind. And these guys said, "Ye kya ho gaya? What's happened here? Last time we had a deficit of women. Now we've got too many." And it's only when the teams talked that we realized that most of these women who had succeeded in the interviews were graduates of this program. So, there was this community empowerment that happened. Another example with youth that I like talking about is, I mean, I haven't talked for a long time, but these are all stories from the past, was we had got together with another NGO in Chirag. This was called Deepalay. And we said, okay, we're all doing these projects where we give benefits to people. What happens if we just go and try and empower them and, have community action? And so we set up this experiment and we took volunteers, one volunteer from each NGO, and these two guys, youth, were sent into a watershed where we had never worked. Again, watershed is a unit of development. So this is an area of few villages where we had never worked.
Where was this?
This was in Almora, in Takula district in Almora. And we said, let's see what you can do. And so initially they said, it's very difficult to work here. Every NGO, people say that if you've come from an NGO, at least build us a water tank or a toilet or get some experts to help with agriculture. You people are coming and just talking to us and nothing's happening. And then a few months later, they said, no, now things are happening. And then we realized that, one guy was very good at football. So he managed to organize this group of youth to play football, and they formed a little football league there. And another guy did something else. And soon you had this group of motivated youth who would then say, Acha, now what do we do? And, government is not doing anything for us. And they were motivated enough that they started then going into the block office saying, what are the programs that are there for us? What can we do? How can we help you also get those programs into our villages? And suddenly we started seeing the kinds of metrics of awareness increase and programs coming into those villages. And I remember some of the block officials said, what have you done there? These guys have suddenly become much more active and motivated than people in other regions, even regions where you're working full time. And so that actually, to me, is what is most important, is getting the communities together, getting them motivated, getting them to have the confidence to believe in themselves. And unfortunately, a lot of the programs we do right now are top-down, that we will tell you what needs to be done. We understand your development. But when it comes from within, and this question you asked about community success of communities, that's when programs are successful, when the community does it itself and believes in itself.
Ownership aspects as well.
Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, that if I wanted to, then can I mobilize a community and plant a forest anywhere? Can I do it literally in terms of does the legal norms in our country allow for that? Like if I'm
No.
I want to,
because that depends on the landowner, and unfortunately the community doesn't necessarily own large tracts of land.
right?
But again, there is, in the Himalayas in particular, communities actually have a fair bit of ownership rights. So in the northeast, you will find that much of the land in states like Nagaland is actually under community ownership, and they have the right to do a lot of things. If we look at central Himalaya, let's say Uttarakhand, there is more limited areas. So in Uttarakhand, for example, you can have private land which belongs to individuals. There's nothing that anybody can do there. It's individually owned, and the owner will decide what needs to be done. So I can't go and plant things there necessarily. There are reserve forests and sanctuaries and national parks where the forest department has the control. So again, there you need to take their permission before you do anything. But Uttarakhand has this institution of one panchayats. So the government technically owns the land, but the usufruct rights of the land lie with the one panchayat of the community. And there, through community, the community has a lot of rights, both to plant and also to a fair amount of rights to the harvest of that land.
Mm-hmm.
So then you can do that, yes.
And if there's a forest already that exists, can I plant more trees?
I mean, you can, and that's what is often being done, because there is a target-driven approach that the forest department has, that we need to plant X number of seedlings every year. So you plant, and often you plant where there already is existing forest. But forests existed before human beings started planting seedlings. So there is a process called natural regeneration. A tree produces fruit, it produces seeds, those seeds germinate and they form a forest. So more often than not, you actually do not need any kind of planting. I mean, 95% of the planting I'd say that we do is of no use. It natural regeneration would take its place. So again, going back to when when I used to work in Chirag, sort of something we had developed was that planting is important, we had figured, and I hold that to be true. But planting is important because, not because those seedlings come up there, but because it helps tie the community to the forest.
Mhm.
Just the mere act
The
of
mere
doing.
act of planting is what is important. So what we did was move from these large decentralized, centralized nurseries of 100,000 seedlings or 50,000 seedlings in a nursery to very small seedlings. I remember in one area in Nokuchiatal, where we felt that there wasn't much of a need for seedlings. We had hundreds of nurseries with 5,000, not even 5,000, sorry, 500 seedlings or 1,000 seedlings. So that's very little. It's, I mean, sort of 10 by 10 or 10 by 20 foot areas is what you need for a nursery. But you had hundreds of nursery persons involved in those raising. And then those people used to say these seedlings are like our bachas, like our children, a small number of seedlings, and they were planted in an adjacent forest. And they would then protect that forest because my seedlings have been planted there.
Right.
And that is what ensured success. So, yes, plantation is often important, but it is important to serve as a visual reminder that something has been done here and therefore we should protect it. It is important as a way to connect the community to that land. But in biologically, in most of the areas where planting is being done, it is not required. And natural regeneration, if you protect that area from fire, from grazing, from other kinds of pressure, natural regeneration will take over.
So you mentioned about different approaches towards ecosystem services or preserving our natural habitat. Was there an approach, like you've been in this field for a very long period of time, and we are just starting on. We're like just in the first, I think, first quarter of this whole journey that you've already walked through,
Yeah.
and we learn about new ideas or things that may work, may not work. But through this journey that we've taken, uh, was there an approach that you thought would not work, but actually did end up working when it came to restoring our natural habitat or preserving it?
So I would say, yeah, my mistakes that I might have made have usually been centered around the ability of people, and I think that was my learning as I grew up. So even when we started thinking about this spring shed program, and the idea that was given was that we can just train local people who are 10th pass or not even 10th pass and create what we initially used to call the barefoot hydrologists. Later on, we said that's not a nice name, so we started calling them para hydrologists. And I said, I mean, I've got a PhD and, okay, not in geology, but I find it hard to grasp some of these concepts of, what is a mountain aquifer and what are the rock types and what is this folding and faulting and what are these guys who are not even 10th pass going to understand it. But not only did they understand it, and not only were we able to build this cadre of para hydrologists, but they did exceptional work in mapping these springs, and the results were there because when we treated what they decided were the recharge zones, what their investigation showed to be the recharge zones, we saw the results in the improved water flow of the springs. So we knew they had hit the right area because you treat a small 2 hectare patch in which you think is supplying that spring way over there, and you see that the water output during the dry season in that spring has improved, so you know you've got it right. So I think underestimating the wisdom of people and putting emphasis on, array, the guy doesn't have the educational degrees, that was one area where I think I did get wrong. Also, I think, and I've talked about it, so I won't get more into it, but underestimating what the power of community mobilization and what the power of people working together can be, and how that is more important than any kind of intervention that you can give them. I think that's been another learning.
We'll come to the end. We've reached the end of the third segment. The stories from the forests can look like, and a ground-based understanding as to what should be done, what could be done, and what is to be done with regard to the challenges, successes of the Indian Himalayan region.
So we've now moved into the final and the last and the final segment of our podcast here, which is a mix of rapid fire and what a future vision, what it looks like to you. So we'll keep it very brief, and we're going to put forth a few questions, and we'd like you to answer it either in one word or like a sentence, and keeping it as brief as possible. So, what is one myth about forests that you'd like to bust?
Oh, my favorite would be that cheer pine is an exotic. Cheer pine is not an exotic, it's a natural species that has existed for millennia in the Himalayan forests.
Okay.
Is there a second myth that you would like to bust? Is there one?
No, I think that's the
That's the one. Okay. In terms of actors in water management, which is that actor that is most underrated?
I would say perhaps mountain aquifers, but now there has been some attention put to them. So I would say forest hydrology, being a forester, the importance of forests in influencing water recharge and hydrology.
Okay. Given that you have a background in ecology, so is there any book or film that really, changed or shaped your ecological perspective?
Say several, but one would be The Unquiet Woods by Ram Guha, which got me to understand that forestry was much more than biology, and that it was a political history, and it made me understand the roles of people. So I would say that would be the single most, but there have been several others as well.
So would Dr. Thadani rewild a park or build a check dam? There are benefits to both, but
Well, they're little different scales, but if I given the choice, I'd say both are important. Both are nature-based services, but rewilding a park would be my dream.
okay.
Great.
Have you done that?
No,
Oh.
I have
plan to?
rewilded small areas.
Yeah.
And we've done a lot of afforestation. I've been involved in many afforestation efforts, which have had components of rewilding, but a true rewilding, no, I haven't done.
All right.
Okay, so now like a future vision. What role do you think the youth can play in shaping a future that's much more, ecological and sustainable?
I think they can play a massive role. I think we need to engage with youth a lot more. In India, we tend to look down at youth, saying age gives us wisdom, but I think youth gives enthusiasm. The youth are the ones who have the most to worry about the future.
Right.
And I think respecting them, making them aware of ecological and scientific issues, and dialogue with them. And I think they are it's a little cliche to say, but they are the guardians of the future.
Nice.
What keeps you hopeful for the future? What's one thing that you hold on to, or maybe many things?
I remain an optimist. So even when the days are dark, I remain hopeful for the future. But I think looking at sort of the dark clouds that are gathering now in terms of climate change, in terms of the ecological degradation we are seeing, I'm hoping and very hopeful that people become aware. As they say that till you haven't seen night, you don't appreciate day, or till you haven't seen winter, you don't appreciate the summer. And it's like that. That till you haven't seen this level of ecological degradation, maybe you won't appreciate what a pristine environment is all about. So I think that gives me hope that we will now move towards that. Also looking into a sort of cultural milieu, the Indian ethos of plurality, of recognizing other living beings is important. The Vasudev Kutumbakam that we talk about. I hope that comes back into us, and we recognize the importance of other living beings and their importance for our own life, because that's what it's all about. We talk about even ecosystem services. It's all about us, but that's fine. But for us to prosper, we need the others to prosper as well.
Right. Yeah. Thank you so much. I think that was a quick segment, I would say, and thank you very much for this insightful conversation, starting from breaking down or like deciphering the jargons, where we spoke about things with respect to nature-based solutions, watershed management, spring shed management, the scale of it, the kind of water that flows, the rich to hill, the rich to valley approach or the valley to valley approach, moving through the basic terminologies, breaking it down, and then deliberating on what challenges may look like for the Indian Himalayan region, and stories from the field. Learning also about how an apex predator can actually bring benefits to the community than harm, which we often fear as humans. Yeah, so there is a requirement to coexist, nature and meaning humans as well. Uh, then talking about the film that inspired you towards the work that you do and the differentiation between forestry and biology that you eventually learned. And thank you so much for making the youth feel like they do hold more importance and power towards change, but also giving us that uh, we shouldn't just sit with that importance of power and should act on it. And certainly this podcast is a certain medium to ensure that mobility or that mobilization happens amongst the youth. We'd like to break it down all the way to like imagining a 15-year-old watching this video should be able to understand or take back at least 10 things, if not all of it, with them, so that they can deliberate on it and then build their understanding on particularly the topic of every episode. So we'd like to really, really thank you for spending your valuable time and coming on the podcast. But I would like to just mention that Dr. Thadani is also writing a book which should be soon released. So I would, if it is not under an embargo, and if you're comfortable sharing, could you just tell us what this is about? I believe it's a two-part book, and you can just brief us on
Yeah,
that.
so I'm co-editor in this book that's just being published by Springer. It's called Himalayan Forests in a Changing World. And it builds upon an earlier work that was done some 30 years ago, and it became longer than we anticipated, so it's become a two-volume book now. So the first volume talks about forests, about the structure and functioning of forests, about issues such as forest biomass and productivity and forest phenology and all the other things that drive a forest. And then the second part is a little bit more applied and focuses more on human beings, on how we have changed the forest, on what chronic disturbance, our extraction of fuel wood, fodder, fertilizer from the forest does to the forest, how it is good, how it is bad, what are the changes it brings about, how silviculture or forest cutting that the British pioneered 150 years ago, what impacts that had on forests, and again tries to look at it in an unbiased light. There was bad done by it, there was some good done by all these forest management principles that were developed during that time. It looks also at things like ecosystem services and nature-based solutions, which we have talked about. So we hope it's a fairly holistic book which talks about forests across the Himalayan arc from the northeast all the way into the northwest and into Pakistan and Afghanistan as well.
Oh, that I think that's very comprehensive, and that would be a great supplementary to the podcast as well. So whenever it's out, I think it would be a desire to read it and learn more about the work. And just wanted to mention that this podcast is or continues to be a joint desire of ours to bring zero cost to consumer information on the Indian Himalayan region, the challenges, the success, the different approaches that have been taken, and we hope that through this podcast there are viewers who are sensitized enough to understand what works and what doesn't work, and take back that optimism, like Dr. Tatani also mentioned, which keeps us hopeful for the future while staying pragmatic in the present. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you
you.
very much.